Hi, this is Misha, and this video is on one of the lesser known submachine gun types of World War II, the Reising M50, manufactured by Harrington and Richardson in the 40s and 50s. Now this isn't a super rare gun, especially in full auto circles because they are very available. But compared to the Thompson here, it is pretty kind of hidden away in time, and it has a very interesting story. Like the Thompson, this was a select fire weapon firing 45 ACP, which was the standard pistol cartridge in the US military of the day. But unlike the Thompson, it was not near as big, heavy, and expensive to produce. So what happened here? As you see, the Thompson was one of the first submachine guns to appear, and really the first to appear at all in America. It was designed at the very end of World War I and into 1919 and 20. It went into production at Colt as the Model 1921, and then later would be manufactured by Auto Ordnance as several variations, including 1928, 1928A, 1928A1, with different changes and things, different forearms, several different variations. It was very, very robust. It was very reliable, especially for a first generation submachine gun. It was reasonably compact. It was also extremely heavy and extremely expensive and time consuming to mass produce. However, it was the only submachine gun available to the US military and US law enforcement in the 1930s. Therefore, the Marines and the Army purchased quantities, relatively small quantities, of the 1928A1 Thompson, as did the FBI and other law enforcement agencies. For peacetime, it was okay, but this gun retailed for $200 plus, give or take, features, magazines, that kind of thing. Also in the 30s, there were two magazine types available, the 20 round stick mag, which is in it here, and there was also a 50 round drum. However, in 1939, as we all know, World War II kicked off, and America could see that eventually war would come and we would get involved in yet another great war. So, submachine guns were becoming more and more useful. They were becoming very common in Europe. And so the idea was that the American military would need large numbers of submachine guns for this new war. Enter a gentleman named Eugene Reising, who was actually very well known in the 30s in the in-gun circles. So much so that he understudied under John Moses Browning, and he even was a junior member of the team that helped with final refinement of the Model 1911, the Colt automatic. So he had some really good credentials. He was a well-known target match shooter. He was an avid sportsman, hunter, just an all-around gun guy. He took a look at the Thompson and said he could do better. He could make something faster, cheaper to produce, more ergonomic, lighter weight, more compact, still firing 45 ACP. He began work in the late 30s, and in June of 1940 he was granted a patent for his Reising submachine gun. He took this patent to H&R, and they agreed, the contract was signed, and they put it into production. The first guns would be produced in March of 1941. And now obviously we're getting very close to the beginning of the war. So what did Reising come up with? This is, of course, like all my guns, a semi-auto, but it's built from an original kit. This is a Model 50, which is the basic model. Starting at the muzzle, we have a cuts compensator. This is similar to on the Thompson, if you look over there, but it's made of thinner steel, so it's not interchangeable. It's a different style, but it's the same concept. Now this tube here is just an extension. This gun was built quite some time ago, so it has an 18-inch barrel to be legal instead of 16, so this tube is longer than it really needs to be. We have a front sight, very typical unprotected blade. We have a 10-inch barrel. Early ones would have 28 ribs on the barrel for cooling, very similar to the Thompson barrel. Moving back, we have still a machined receiver, but it's a simple tube, as opposed to the much more complicated machined receiver of the Thompson. Simple stamped rear sight. It is adjustable, very simple. You just pull it up and physically move it for elevation. As you see, it has a more traditional carbine type stock. It's pretty much full length. If this didn't have the extended barrel, the cuts compensator would just come to here, so the stock is pretty much full. We have sling swivels, metal butt plate, this over. We have a selector switch here for safe, semi, full. We have a mag catch here, pretty standard, very simple. And you see these parts. This is the mag well, the trigger guard, the rear sight, the selector. This is all stamped steel, not machined steel. So, much faster to produce. This fed from 20 round magazines. They are double stack single feed with a very simple straight follower. Let me get a Thompson mag out here just to show you. They're similar to Thompsons, but they are not interchangeable. See? Dimensionally very similar, a little bit taller. This is a little bit lighter, not by much, but it does have a spine in the back like a Thompson. However, it does not have the bolt hold open like a Thompson would. And the Thompson has a much more complicated follower because it is a double feed design, whereas this is simple single. See, the mags are similar but different. Just a straight in mag well. And probably the most interesting feature, how this thing cocks. If you notice, there's not a cocking handle here, it's here. You actually use your finger. There's an inlet in the stock, and this is your cocking. So it is both out of the way, even though it reciprocates, it's hidden inside the stock, and it's ambidextrous as far as that goes. So this was Reising's design. One final note, it fired from a closed bolt, whereas the Thompson fired from an open bolt. And so it used a striker system and separate floating firing pin to work with it. What this did, the Thompson was around $200 in 1940. The Reising Model 50, when it was introduced in 1941, was just over $60. So obviously much cheaper. And as H&R would get production up and running and streamline the production, that price would drop to about $50. This was due in part, large part, to the simplified receiver, the stamped metal, the closed bolt operating system gave this gun quite good accuracy for a submachine gun. It was quite controllable on full auto, very controllable on semi. It was much lighter than the Thompson by as much as 4 pounds. This is it's a very light, handy gun. It's a lot like the M1 carbine as far as size and weight. So this gun in 1941 was one of the most modern submachine guns in the world, and the most modern in a lot of ways in America. The M50, the fixed stock version, was soon joined later that year by the M55, which was a metal side folding stock. So this would fold back, and it lacked the cuts compensator, which took the overall barrel length from 11 inches down to straight 10. So an inch shorter in the front and a folding stock. Interestingly, the Model 55 was the shortest, most compact, and lightest submachine gun in production in the world when it was introduced in 1941. So pretty, ahead of its time. The Model 60 would be released later. It would be a semi-automatic only version. I guess you could call it a very early predecessor of what today we would call a PCC, a pistol caliber carbine, or a sub-caliber carbine. The Model 60 would be essentially the exact same gun, just no full auto. The receivers were pretty much exactly the same though. And it would have an 18-inch barrel as opposed to 10, and no cuts compensator. Also, many Model 60s would be fitted with the specific stock. Some would not have sling swivels. Only the early ones would have the barrel fins. Later they would just go to smooth barrels on the Model 60s. It would still fire 45 ACP, and it would still feed from 20-round detachable mags. Finally, the Model 65 joined the lineup, the M65, and it was a Model 60 but chambered for 22 LR instead of 45 ACP. It still used this unique cocking system, but it was in 22. This is mostly a delayed blowback gun, but it does have a little bit of delay built into the bolt system, so it's kind of analogous to, say, like the MP5 with the roller delay. It doesn't use rollers, I'm not saying that, but it does have a delaying action built into the system to keep its rate of fire reasonable, also to help with accuracy. So there was a slight locking or delaying system in the receiver to keep the bolt from just recoiling straight back. But it doesn't truly lock, of course. So this gun, it was released, it was light, it was inexpensive, it was accurate for a submachine gun, and it was released right before World War II kicked off. The first military unit in the U.S. to try these out were the Marine paratroopers. In late 1941, they tried the Reising Model 50 and 55 out alongside the Johnson 1941 rifle and light machine gun. And this gun really should have taken the world by storm, because just a few weeks later, Pearl Harbor would happen and America would need submachine guns. The Thompson was expensive. It was only being produced by Auto Ordnance, who could only make so many a month anyway, because even, with all the money in the world, you could only make Thompsons so fast. So the people started to look immediately towards the Reising. The U.S. Army, the U.S. Navy tested it, as did the Marines. And it was tested at Quantico. So why didn't this become the M3? Why didn't, instead of going to the M3 grease gun, why didn't this replace the Thompson as the cheap alternative? Well, several reasons. In testing at Quantico, I'll start there, it's the best place. They decided that this gun was adequate if kept clean and well maintained, with those caveats. The U.S. Army, though, after trying it out, immediately dismissed it, said no, we don't want it. They had some Thompsons, they had the M1 carbine in the works, they had the grease gun in the works, the M1 Garand was in service. They said that Reising was not durable enough and it was not reliable enough. So they passed it over. However, the Navy and the Marines, who did not have the budget or the resources or the design programs of the Army, could not afford to be as picky. So both the Navy and Marines adopted the Reising Model 50 and Model 55 as substitute standard issue. They even purchased a few Model 60s for guard duty and training. There are photographs of M60s in military hands. And the Coast Guard also purchased some to keep on board their cutters. So we have the Marines, the Navy, and the Coast Guard using these, but the Army said nope, and they went a different route. The military would order several thousand. I could not ever find original purchase orders for 1942 for how many they ordered from H&R, but it was a relatively large number, several thousand. The Reising would first see combat in August of 42 in the hands of Marines at Guadalcanal. It would also be used on several other Pacific islands. So it was in combat very quickly. Now, remember, this gun was in production. They didn't have to wait on it like they did the grease gun or the carbine. It was ready to go, and H&R could crank these things out. So that they received several thousand in 1942 and already had them in heavy, hot combat. So that's kind of the peak of this gun's story, because that's when things start to fall apart. Don't get me wrong, on the Pacific Islands, it was hell on men, material, equipment. M1 Grands jammed. Even O3 Springfields would have problems occasionally. The sand, especially the volcanic sand, the salt water, just the general moisture, the hot and heavy, close, nasty, bloody combat. Yeah, it was hell. So all guns jammed. So that's not surprising that some Reisings jammed. The problem is that the Reising jammed a lot. And worse than jamming, it broke parts frequently. Some of the flaws that quickly became apparent were the firing pin. It was made of stainless, it was just made of basically bare steel, and it would rust up. The single piece recoil guide would bend and break. Many of the stamped parts would fail. They just weren't that tough, and when they got beat around. The cuts compensator, which is made of much thinner steel than on a Thompson, these slats would bend and break. This bottom cocking system, which is pretty neat, had a few drawbacks. For one, if the sling was over it, it would block it, and it would cause the Marine to have to fiddle around to get to it, which doesn't seem like a big deal to a civilian, but in combat. Also, because this reciprocated, if you were shooting it and your finger drifted up in this slot, it would get banged up very nicely by this tab. The early guns, the original Reisings, were blued, and bluing was just not up to snuff for handling that kind of an environment. To really cap things off, these guns are not easy to disassemble to clean and maintain. There's a main screw here. You basically need something slotted. Take it off, and that separates the action from the stock. There's also a cap back here. You unscrew to get the bolt system out. So you need tools to disassemble it, and there are several small parts that come out, because remember, this is a closed bolt design, so you have a striker spring and all that in addition. And when a part would break, they quickly found they couldn't just grab a part out of a buddy's rifle. A lot of the parts in this gun were fitted together to greater or lesser extents at H&R, at the factory. So these were not parts interchangeable guns. They were not standardized parts guns. This is a big problem for the U.S. military, who had been doing this system of interchangeable parts throughout its guns beginning as far back as the Civil War. By the time of the Spanish-American War, the Philippine uprisings, and of course World War I, American guns were expected to be interchangeable part-wise. I mean, even bolts with headspace wasn't even supposed to be a concern. That wasn't the case with Reisings. Some parts may or may not fit. You just couldn't know. The guns just proved very quickly that they weren't designed with a military mindset. They were designed more with accuracy and lightweight as their primary goals, not durability and dependability and ease of maintenance. So these quickly gained a reputation in late 1942 for being unreliable. Now H&R was not deaf. They were trying their best. They would introduce several changes throughout 42 and early 43. For one, they would go from the blued finish on the early guns to a Parkerized, phosphated, mil-spec type finish. Many people call the Parkerized guns military and the blued guns commercial. This isn't really true. The military used both. But the later production guns would be Parkerized. They would go from 28 barrel fins to 14 to simplify production and to give better strength there. They would make the front sight drift adjustable. They would improve, strengthen the rear sight. They would improve the trigger guard, attaching it with 3 screws instead of 2. One major improvement they would make would be the mag catch. The original mag catch you could only release the mags by pulling it back. They introduced a more modern type of mag catch that you could also push forward or pull. So you could either push or pull it, which is actually pretty neat. On the selector, they added these 2 one on each end raised to keep your finger on it more securely without slipping off. They would go to a 2-piece guide rod in here, which is much more dependable. You can't see it, it's inside. Anyway, and they would improve the firing pit by going to stainless steel that wouldn't so easily corrode. So they would do their best to upgrade these. One other problem you'll run into, these are just mag pouches over here, guys, for the gun. Grab this. This is another 20 round mag. As I said, it's and this one does have the slightly more fancy follower there. 20 round double stack single feed. They would introduce a new magazine. Their solution, as we've talked about in several other videos, double stack single feed mags don't work great, especially in harsh environments. Many people would go to a double feed, double stack, or something else. What H&R did, they took it and they actually decreased the magazine capacity. 20 rounds was already not a lot. They reduced it to 12. They took the standard body and they dimpled the sides, making it a single stack, single feed. This was much more reliable. It's like a pistol mag. I mean, it's just feeding them straight in. There's not a lot of room for problems there. But that took a gun, a submachine gun, that already had a pretty small capacity and made it even smaller. it basically meant it had no utility in full auto. It turned it into a self-loading carbine, and that's the problem. At this time in 43, the M1 carbine was being deployed in ever larger numbers, and the M1A1 was soon to appear with its folding stock. The Thompson also received a better magazine. It went from 20 rounds to 30, and these always were good mags. There was also a wartime expedient production of the Thompson known as the M1 and even the M1A1, which was simplified for mass production. They never were near as cheap as the Reising, but they were much cheaper than the pre-war versions, so you had that. Also, the grease gun was about to hit the scene a year later, which was very cheap. It was even much cheaper than the Reising. So the competition was just getting a lot hotter by 1943. I don't have one here, I wish I did to show you, but on the M55, the folding stock version, it had problems too. Because the folding stock had been designed to be as light and cheap as possible, it was not very durable. It was a pretty flimsy stock. It even sometimes would fold under just recoil. If not that, it would just get beat up and bent, and yeah, so even that didn't work too great. So by the latter half of 1943, the Marines were starting to pull the Reisings, the M50, the M55s, out of service. There are even reports of some officers just dumping their weapons overboard accidentally. Oops, I dropped it, butterfingers, so they could get issued an M1 carbine or anything else. A lot of these Marine guns would be sent over to the USA and reissued to guards or given to the Navy or given as lend-lease to Canada, Russia, and the others. The Marines ended up having about 80,000 of these in inventory, so quite a large number. Again, for only taking delivery for about a year and a half, they had received a good chunk. 80,000 submachine guns is not insignificant. But by 1944, really no one in the U.S. military was acquiring new Reisings. It was, after all, a substitute standard adopted in 1942 at a time when any gun was better than no gun, but by 1944 there were much better options and the military went with it. The OSS, interestingly, would acquire some of the M55s because they didn't need to use them frequently and they could keep them clean much better. And they didn't really have to worry about parts interchangeability because it was just them. And they really liked how compact and light it was. So the M55 did have kind of a twilight career with the OSS. That was pretty well it. The remaining M50s would just, like I said, be used as guard duty guns throughout the remainder of World War II in America. The Navy and Coast Guard would still keep several on board ships. They didn't really need them that frequently. They were just there for emergency use. And since they were mostly locked up in lockers, they were able to keep them reasonably clean and well maintained. Unlike, say, Marines storming a beach or paratroopers dropping into anything. After World War II, the U.S. military would surplus out pretty much all its Reisings. And it would offer them to local police departments in America at very, very good rates. And so many police departments in the late 40s acquired Reising submachine guns and some Reising M60 carbines, the semi-auto. And here the Reising's reputation kind of bounced back. In police hands, this gun did a hell of a lot better. Again, its attributes of accuracy, lightweight, really stood out for police. But then again, a police officer wasn't storming a beach, wasn't rolling through a forest or a jungle without, able to do good cleaning. A police officer could go home and clean his gun at the end of the day. And most of them were just left in storage for emergency use anyway. It also helps that it's not a terribly menacing looking gun. The Thompson acquired a pretty evil reputation because of gangsters in the 1930s. It's, you know, by the standards of the 1940s, this is a very modern, this was the assault rifle of its day, to use the political terms, or assault weapon, sorry, I guess that's what they call them, isn't it? This was the assault weapon. This gun, though, if you look at it, it looks not too dissimilar to a hunting gun. I mean, it doesn't have quite the menacing look to it, especially the M50, the semi-auto with the long barrel. So it was a little more politically acceptable to see police officers armed with these, and it did give them either a single shot or in an emergency a select fire gun, which they probably didn't even need that frequently. And the 12-round mag wasn't really a detriment. 12 rounds was still double what a revolver would have held. So much so that some of the later production guns had a modified mag well with dimples in each side that only let 12-round mags fit in. So, kind of interesting there. So this gun's shortcomings in military service really didn't hurt it in police use. H&R would wrap up production in 1949, closing up the whole production line, model 50, 55, 60, 65, with about 120,000 produced. So, relatively good size number. However, this wouldn't actually last for long. It had a second life, believe it or not. This gun was kind of blessed in ways. I mean, it kept kind of bouncing back and finding a new place. Around 1950, the production line, only after being dormant about a year, was started back up for limited use. Throughout the 50s, H&R would make about 5,500 more select fire guns and about 2,000 more semi-automatic guns. So not a large number, but, you know, 7,500, some. And they would sell these both in America and to some overseas clients. But by the late 50s, it really was over. They would ship their last Reisings in the early 60s and shut down the production line. That's it, right? No. There's one more. There's one more little thing in this gun story. See, it just keeps on going. It really is an interesting gun. And they're really fun to shoot, just as civilians. In the 80s, Numeric, up in New York, egunparts.com today, purchased pretty much whatever was left over of the Reising production from H&R, be it drawings, tooling, parts, receivers, mostly complete guns, anything. And they would use these to build a few hundred more guns in the mid to late 80s. And even a lot of these were registered select fire receivers, because they were older H&R receivers that they could build up, register and build up. They would also do semi-autos. They would have to make some new parts themselves, stocks. They made quite a few stocks, quite a few butt plates. So there were parts that Numeric had to manufacture new in the 80s, but these guns were mostly built from original H&R Reising leftover parts. So one little more production spat there in the 80s. And even today, Numeric still has a few random parts left over for the Reising. For a long time, they were the place to go if you needed spare parts. But they're finally running out. They really don't have much left in that these days. So now this really is the end of the story. Interesting gun, I think. Eugene Reising was a very respected gun designer. He was not a novice, yet his gun just really wasn't a good military gun. For a civilian or police gun, it really excelled, but for a military gun, it just wasn't designed with those demands in mind. Also, it goes to show you that you can have accuracy, but at the same time, if you tighten all the parts up, make everything tightly fitted for accuracy, you're going to lose out on durability. Everything in this gun is very tightly fitted, And that means if any dirt, grime, mud, sand, snow, whatever gets in here, it's going to jam things up because there's no room for it to escape. The Thompson is much more generous inside its receiver, with more places for crud to get pushed into and out of the way of the bolt moving. The Reising today is probably most famous for being one of the cheapest legal registered select fire class 3 type guns you can get in America. There are quite a few of these on the registry. You can still pick one up for, for a long time they were $4,000 or even $3,000. I think nowadays they're up to about $5,500 to $6,500, guys. I haven't priced one in about a year, but they're compared to what Thompsons go for and what grease guns go for. They're very reasonable. So a lot of guys will buy one of these as one of their first forays into the NFA. They want to select fire, and it does. It fires a common cartridge. Mags are available. I've got 6 here, and I didn't even try. They're not cheap anymore, but you can still find them pretty readily. There's a lot of mags out there. Parts are still available, and they work really well. They fire well. Not a lot of recoil for as light as this gun is. Well, I just thought we would share this. I think the story is very interesting. Hope you enjoyed my little story time here. We did talk about this gun briefly in a video about 3 years ago, but wanted to revisit it. And in that video, we had a Model 60. As I said, this is a Model 50 parts kit built on a civilian legal semi-receiver. And of course, this is my 1928 A1 Thompson re-weld, also a legal semi-auto. If you have any questions or comments below, please post them. If you like the video, please click like. And if you haven't already subscribed, we'd really appreciate it if you'd do that too. This is Misha, and we'll catch you next time.